Hello, my name is David Brown. I'm a deaf-blind educational specialist. And in this module, I'm talking about educational and school issues with children with CHARGE syndrome. Unlike the other modules I've made, this is a big, diffuse one. It was much harder for me to think exactly what to include and what to exclude. If I'm just talking about one sensory system like vision or the vestibular sense, it's much more contained. This one can sprawl all over the place, and I have tended to sprawl a bit. But I'm hoping it will, when it's finished, it will all have made a certain amount of sense. It will certainly have been fairly comprehensive in covering the kinds of things that you need to think about when an educational program or a school placement is coming up. One of the questions I'm asked all the time, especially by parents, is what's the best kind of school for a child with CHARGE syndrome? And what they mean is, I usually respond with a question. And what they mean is, should it be a blind school? Or should it be a school for deaf children? Should it be an autism program? Should it be a special education program? Or should it be a general education setting in mainstream? Should the child be in a mainstream class? Should they be in a special education class? Should they split their time between a special setting and the general education setting with their regular peers? And it's an impossible question to answer because it depends on the blind school, the deaf school, the autism program, the regular school. Really, the child needs to be in a school that's got the right qualities rather than the right type of school. And also, of course, the parents' wishes are very important. If the parent's really keen that their child should be in a mainstream setting, then maybe we should be trying to create a program in a mainstream setting. If the parent is quite adamant that they want their child in a deaf program, then we should be helping them to find ways to create an appropriate program in a deaf hearing impairment setting. So there are lots of factors, and it isn't a case of children with CHARGE need to be in a school for blind and visually impaired children or deaf children or whatever. It's much more individualized than that. So it's more difficult. You know, people love rules. They love nice black and white rules, and they're not very helpful in this issue. So trying to think what to include, where to start, I came up with a couple of propositions. And I'm a bit of a provocateur anyway by nature. And as I've got older, I've become more and more provocative. And it's a bit like turning into a grumpy old fella, I suppose. But I see it as a valuable professional skill of mine. And I've come up with 4 propositions, and I'll start with those. Proposition 1, that CHARGE syndrome is the most complex condition that we know, and the unique combination of true multisensory impairment with multiple other anomalies, including some which are potentially life-threatening, can lead to variability in functioning and periods when the child may be unavailable for attending and learning. Now, that last phrase, periods when the child might be unavailable for attending and learning, can mean physically available if the child is ill, if they're hospitalized, if they're having surgery, or if they're at home sick, then they're not going to be available, and that might happen very frequently, and that has to be accepted by the educational program or the school where they're placed. But it can also mean that because of their multiple issues, especially their sensory impairments, the child might not be available for learning. They might be there in the room, but other priorities take them over, other needs take over, and we need to be aware of that, seeing that and understanding that and helping the child deal with it in order to get them to a better place to attend and to learn again. And that comes primarily from learning to know the individual child, but it also comes from learning about charge syndrome and learning about multisensory impairment. Then proposition 2, that the right school and educational program for each child with charge never already exists, but has to be created for each individual child. The program has to be fitted to the child, not the child fitted to the program. I've often spoken to schools where there's an idea that a child might go there. I will give my professional view on what that child might need. And the person at the school will say something like, oh, we don't do that here. And that tells me straight away that this might not be the right school for the child. If the school is already thinking this child will have to fit in to everything we already have, then there's going to be a mismatch. And at the very first level of getting a child into school and building a relationship, really the school and the program is going to have to fit themselves to the child. Proposition 3, that a successful and appropriate educational program begins and depends upon skilled assessment, which is flexible, ongoing, and sensitive. All children with charge syndrome can be assessed successfully, provided the people doing the assessment know what they're doing. And again, that needs people who are open-minded, who are prepared to learn about charge syndrome and multisensory impairment. And I know that Nancy Hartshorn has done a whole module on assessment, and I will be complementing that with a few more remarks about assessment in a moment in this module. And then proposition 4, my last proposition, that anyone responsible for designing and delivering a child's educational program needs some familiarity with charge syndrome, which is kept up to date. With the increasing amount of information about charge now available, this is perfectly feasible. There's no longer an excuse for anyone who's involved professionally with a child with charge to say things like, oh, I don't know about charge syndrome, because there's a lot of information available. But there's an obligation on the parents and the family members and professionals who already know the child to let these new professionals know where the useful information is and how to access it. And I often, when a child is first going into a program, I will email a small selection of articles or a couple of internet links to the relevant professionals, just to give them a heads up on where they can start to get an idea of who they're working with and what they might need to expect. So we're trying to get people to think about multiple sensory issues, multiple health issues, problems with fatigue, problems with the child being available and paying attention to what we want them to pay attention to, priorities, and that's a very big issue in setting up the initial educational plan, and thinking about the child's interests and motivators, because they need to be very prominent in the educational plan if the child is to be engaged and wanting to learn and making themselves available for teaching and for learning. This next slide is one I made really in response to a question that I'm asked very often by professionals. And the question is, why are children with charge syndrome so lazy? And of course, on the whole, they're not only not lazy, but they're remarkably goal-oriented in the way they approach life and in the things they do. And I think people just completely misunderstand how difficult it is to function if you have this syndrome. And you see on this slide, I came up with the 21 charge issues which contribute to fatigue. I explored things like visual impairment, hearing impairment, vestibular dysfunction, abnormally low or high muscle tone, breathing difficulties, heart problems. All those things I explored on the internet because I knew that I would find evidence that these conditions cause fatigue. Each of these individually causes fatigue. And then when we consider that of these 21, many of the children we know with charge have at least half of these issues that they have to deal with, maybe more. It's extraordinary that they do most of the things they bother to do. It's extraordinary that they're prepared to be so social, that they're prepared to try to fit in social settings, that they're prepared to work at tasks set for them by other people, whether it's their family or members of the professional team. And I don't have time here to go into detail, but I'm sure if you yourself explore on the internet some of these issues, you will come across fatigue and the extraordinary challenges that each of these issues presents. You will find that very, very easily. And so it's quite a good thing to throw at people if they start thinking the child is a bit lazy. And of course, one of the misconceptions, these are children who, because of their sensory issues, they often like to get horizontal. They like to lie down. They like their body and their head fully supported. They like to fix their head so they can use their vision more effectively. And the moment people see them getting down on the floor or down on the couch or putting their head down on the table, people think lazy rather than the positive things that they could be thinking. So I hope this slide will be very helpful for you.